Bam.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. And so this is, I'm Jason Thornton, and this is
Tim Rush.
And we are ministers at Memorial Drive Church of Christ. If you haven't ever joined us before, we always have conversations around our sermon, both before and after. And so with our social distancing practices, we started to record those conversations. These are unscripted conversations, unedited conversations that we would usually have. The difference is we're just sharing them with you. And so, so Tim was the preacher this last Sunday, and we share preaching duties, so we go back and forth. But Tim was the preacher, and so Tim, just curious, what struck you, what stands out to you about your sermon this last Sunday?
Well, the thing that jumps out first is the exchange you and I had over text Sunday afternoon, and that sense that am I leaving things too vague? Am I not saying enough about what's going on in society and culture right now? And leaving, hey, this feels weird to say it like this, but I'm presenting what the Bible says. Now you take it and apply it to your walk. Where it feels like, should we be saying more about our opinions? Should we be saying more in an activist type of way? And just really feeling at what point will people stop listening? At what point will people not hear what it is that we mean to communicate?
Yeah, that is huge to me. As a professional communicator, man, we have to constantly think through what's the best way for this to stick that I can at least imagine, with whatever. I have started classes with the most controversial statement, and then walk through the content, and I've had people go and blow up Facebook, and they didn't listen to anything beyond the controversial statement, And so it's not us being afraid. I'm not saying I don't carry fear. It's that idea of what is shrewd as serpents and gentle as doves, because you want the whole message to get across, not just one soundbite. And I know we're in the culture of the soundbite. And maybe that's something that I need to let God lead me in more, but I want people to listen to the whole message. And if you're so put off by this, I question the thing. And here's the key: we can't predict who's going to be put off by what.
Right.
Out with my message, or do I have to say everything in my message? Because what we're assuming is the people that listen are listening mostly for God's Spirit, and God's Spirit will keep teaching. We just stir that pot. We motivate that.
Yeah. And, a piece of it is, as we listen to other people, which is, I feel like that's the goal in society right now, is to listen to opinions you don't agree with and try to take it in. I feel like my own opinion changes constantly.
Right.
I'll see something on the news and I'll think, well, that's the definitive statement until I watch the other side of the news. And then I'm wondering, and then I have one conversation with one friend and one with another. And it feels like, man, I'm glad I didn't say what I wanted to say to my friend on Facebook. Because it does feel like this is a moving target, and where it changes daily.
Yeah, and there's a proverb that talks about every story. I'm slaughtering it, but every story sounds good when you only hear one side.
Yeah.
And it's wisdom to wait. It's wisdom to acknowledge what you don't know and not make a decision based on appearances. Matter of fact, God says, man makes decision by appearances. I judge the heart. So wait on me to teach you about this. And so I've always struggled with these, well, this looks this way to me, so it must be the way it is. Now, You have a George Floyd dynamic. That's a very different look than a lot of other videos I've seen over the years. You know what I mean? There's a much more cut and dried case to that,
Yeah.
Things that and the other thing is man, it is really challenging. What is it that merits me condemning? Because that's the call I get periodically, is you need to condemn this behavior. And I'm like, and this is ironic to me. When I got to Memorial, I felt like the church in general, not just Memorial, but was crying out. They were crying out against raising up one sin and making it worse than another.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, the discussion was homosexuality or drinking or this kind of thing, and everybody was appalled by the legalism that would elevate condemnation of homosexuality over any other sin. And now we're doing the same thing with racism. We're saying no, racism is the biggest sin, and these other sins aren't near as big. My experience says you give it 20 years, and well, not even that long, but there'll be another biggest sin. And so is racism a sin? Absolutely. Why would we even, anybody that would not think that feeling they're superior over someone else based on anything is conducive to Christ is just wrong. I mean, it's just so blatantly wrong. And I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. It absolutely exists. The question is, how do we as people of faith talk about it? And what do we say about it in light of eternity? And that's a lot of burden on our preachers.
Yeah.
To figure out, how do I help people keep listening so they can be open to God's Spirit, comment on what is actually fact, even just in the factors we've laid out, and there are more factors. It's a tough position to be in. And I sympathize with all pastors, regardless of their approach.
Yeah. It does make me grateful these last few weeks. Clint Davis, a couple of weeks ago, with his elder time at the end of our service with his prayer, I feel like he was reading a prepared statement. Is that right?
It seemed that way, yeah.
But and then Daryl this week, speaking with a lot of passion, and I just feel like I really appreciate that from our elders right now, because a lot of times, and we've talked about this, I don't know where is my place to speak up sometimes. Because I don't know, is it fair for me to state my opinion because it feels like me stating my opinion is what Memorial needs to believe. And I feel like that's not fair. So I do vacillate between what is mine to carry and I feel like that's always there's a rub there among a lot of people of who's leading your church. Is it the elders or is it the preachers?
Right.
And so when the elders are stepping up and setting leadership goals, I feel like that's a very safe place to say, all right, I'm behind that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, how do you conceptualize the role of preacher or pastor? Different denominations do it differently. Some, the pastor is completely, his perspective goes, in churches of Christ, the elders are the ones in charge. And the way I've always been taught to conceptualize it is functionally, we are the mouthpiece for the elders. And so if our elders so frequently or so infrequently infringe on what we say, they never, I can't think of a single time they said, you need to say this or say that. Now, when we submit things to them, they'll process it with us. Yeah. And if something came up that they didn't agree with, they would let us know.
Yeah.
But we are the opposite of micromanaged.
Yeah. Well, I think, man, is this okay to say out loud? Recently, something came up and they said, we don't agree. I don't agree. But we're not infringing on your right to hold your own opinion. And so, I mean, it could have been dicey in a lot of places. Right. But here the elders were like, I feel like they made a very clear distinction. This is not our place to give you your opinion. Even when they weren't in agreement with our opinion. And I feel like there's too much behind that to say, okay, when was that right for an elder to do? When is it not? But it really made me appreciate where we are at. That disagreements can be had between the preachers and the elders, and man, it was a good conversation, and Yeah. It's a weird dynamic, I feel like, for churches of Christ.
Yeah. I don't know if any elder of ours watches this. David might, but I need everybody else, if anybody else is watching this, to know this is not for their consumption. But I remind myself all the time, I am in rarefied air
Mm-hmm.
in terms of a minister working with an eldership. My dad, I have so many friends in ministry that would just die to work with this eldership. And I need to be clear. We know each other well enough. We know the good, the bad, and the ugly about each other. So this is not lip service, but that dynamic of being able to think and ponder and share and explore without fear
Mm-hmm.
of instant payback, vindication, is sadly very unique in my experience. Most ministers walk on eggshells about everything. And so yeah, I mean, it's a blessing. Back to this issue of, okay, so a little history on me. I made such a mess of my life between the time I was, 16, 17 and 21, that I became very convinced I had nothing I needed to hide in Jesus all the time. I mean, it wasn't hypothetical. I am, by the grace of God, I do not have much more of a messy life based on just those few years of the risk I took, of the stupid things I did, of hurtful things I did. So I am very convinced when I speak, I do not want to go beyond the word. I mean, I really try to be super careful that even if there are questions, and see, I'm not an analyst, I'm not a organized person, but man, when I'm presenting a message, I want to think through what might somebody else be thinking, how would I answer that biblically. I want to make sure I have a Bible answer ready. And so it's a huge emphasis for me. So when you talk about social activism in general, and let's put it in another context. I remember when I would go to conferences and somebody would get up and say, if you are not actively participating in pro-life movement, you are not a Christian. If you are not actively participating in making sure that same-sex marriage isn't legalized, then you are not a Christian. Then it shifted. If you're not actively, I had a guy write me one time who I hadn't talked to for years, who had, I think he'd identify as homosexual. And when there was the shooting down in Florida at the nightclub, he wrote me and just crushed me. I mean, just like I had done the shooting myself. When are you going to learn? When are you going to change things? And I was actually in Ecuador when it happened. So I got the message like 2 days later, and I wasn't even aware of what had happened. But it was just the expectation that everybody has on all different lenses. Like there are people that say, if you're really Christian, you'll be, well, take Trump, you'll really be for Trump. Or if you're really Christian, you won't be for Trump. And the thing is that cuts through all that, back to the pro-life dynamic. And I am pro-life, but it's that added thing that silence is participating in the violence. I just need us to acknowledge Jesus was silent about the racism in his day. If you're looking for a statement that Jesus says, all racism is wrong. Now, what did he say? I will call all men to me. So when you say vague, I'm like, well, that reminds me of Jesus. And Jesus was in the middle of an incredibly oppressed society and incredibly racist society. Him talking to the Samaritan woman at the well goes against every norm in his society. It's a shocking story, and yet if that existed today, I think rise up and condemn him. Many in the church would rise up and condemn him because if we didn't know it was Jesus, because he's not railing against the system. He's not condemning Rome for their oppression. He's not condemning the fellow Jews for their racism. It's really a startling thing. And so then when I come to this subject, like the pro-life deal, and people say, well, if you're not marching, you hate children and you don't believe in Jesus. I'm like, I don't see Jesus even marching ever, 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 number one. And he could have cried out against homosexuality and abortion and racism every day. It was so prevalent. I don't know about abortion. I don't know statistics on that, but I can't imagine, they were doing a lot of evil things there. So anyway, I could go on and on about that, but it leaves me in odd footing because I can't be within the scriptures in my mind, and everything that I'm given is, well, Jesus stood up for the oppressed. And I'm like, can you show me how he did that in an activistic way? Yes, he reached to the oppressed person, but even then he wasn't trying to free them from their oppression.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go on and on about this, but it just makes this a much more complicated subject matter than I think is appreciated.
Yeah. I'm thinking right now about having Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector
Yep.
in his 12, where one of them thinks the other one can't be a Jesus follower and hold their position. And so,
Right.
how in the world did Jesus hold that group together and value each member and let
Yeah.
the other one know the other one was valued? At the same time, Paul dealt plainly with Peter over racism. And so I think there is a point to say what you are doing is wrong.
Right.
But for me, we don't have an example of social media, that
Sure.
Paul talked to Peter face to face. He didn't say to whom it may concern on Facebook, and so there is this, where does social media fit? Where is it appropriate? I'm convinced it is appropriate to, I say, call it when you see it. Maybe this is me, but I think even calling it when you see it, you don't just throw a grenade and walk away, but it's ministry, and it's
Right.
stepping into relationship with the person you're seeing it in.
Well, and so even in those examples of the Spirit God in Acts 10, where years after Jesus meets Peter, years after Pentecost, God gives Peter a vision, and it leads Peter eventually to speak to Gentiles at Cornelius' house, this kind of thing. I want to be very clear. I don't think Jesus was pro-racist any more than I think Jesus was pro-abortion or even though he doesn't talk about it. Now we see the flip side where he talks about, life and how important life is. And certainly the Old Testament speak about it. I'm simply talking about this. Even Paul's correction of Peter in Galatians, that's not pushing against the system. It's talking to an individual that's showing blatant racism.
Yeah.
And I have no problem with going to a person who's showing blatant racism and say, hey, that's not right. I don't even have a problem of, if I microaggressions, pulling that person aside and saying, hey, I'm not sure what's happening, but this is a feel I get. Can you help me understand that? It's the idea of taking that and it's ironic to me. I feel like there's a certain population that really hammers judge not lest you be judged, especially when we're talking about sins that they didn't like, or they didn't, they felt like we were too strong. We as the church historic, and then you turn around and, okay, so let's say I love Trump, and you just can't stand him. Okay. What would Matthew 7 do? Number one, don't judge me for loving Trump. Number two, you'd remove your bias, your plank, and then you'd come and talk to me about adoring a man. Let's say I'm just out there, I worship every word he says, and you say to me, hey, help me understand this. You're taking the speck out of my eye. Help me understand this. I know you believe in love one another. When you see this statement, how do you think that through? And then it goes on and it says, don't throw your pearls before swine. So I don't know where that all fits in the don't judge, because you're judging people to be swine and dogs. So
Right.
And maybe that's the key. Maybe if I'm a Trump lover, then I need to be perceived in that. But the idea is the humility. As soon as I think I'm judging you not to be Christian on Christ, I'm into legalism. And it doesn't matter which brand of legalism that takes.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought about Paul writing to Philemon Is that right?
Yeah.
And asking him to take back his slave. Um,
Yeah. And not hurt him.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's a violation of God culture to own
Right.
slaves. But Paul was not saying, "And you are not a Christian."
Right.
You know, the the Israelites, man, I've thought about this a lot recently about God rescuing them from slavery, and and then they immediately take slaves,
Yeah.
and God had to put it in the law. Okay, every 7 years you got to let the slaves go free. You know,
Yeah.
it was yeah, it seems like it's consistently against God's nature, and God is consistently dealing with people.
Yeah.
Um, and it does make me think, how frustrated must God be with us, and how much grace does He keep offering us? And
Yeah.
and it's so easy for me to see that blind spot in somebody else's eye, and God's going, and yours, Tim, and yours. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And so I feel like based on what I've said, I need to be super clear, which even that it's like, is it not clear in the way I live? I believe the lens that we have to look through is the lens of the greatest command. And it's not just the greatest command in that one story, that one interaction. It's the greatest command at all times. Every verse I read in the Bible, every interaction, that's the greatest command. And then whatever it is. So attend church, don't forsake the assembly, has to be under love God and love everybody with your full self. So before I even get to attend church or don't show racism, I need to make sure I'm loving God and loving others. Then I deal with that.
mm-hmm.
And that's kind of that's an example of taking the log out of your eye, is when I say, wait a minute, I'm saved by grace by an all loving God. I should be condemned to hell. Like you said on Sunday, I'm an object of wrath, da, 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 Then I take mine out, which is me saying, I'm humble. I'm not worth anything. And then I go to the person and I say, and I'm asking myself, what's the most loving thing? So when I go to Monroe, I mean, I can't even tell you. And if you don't know, Monroe's a middle school that I've been going to for like 7 years or 6 years. And so when I go to Monroe, man, it's 75-80% African-American students, 15% Hispanic, and the remainder are white or Asian. And so when I go there, man, it took me 3 years to earn the right to hardly say anything. I was invisible in the hallways. I would talk to a student one week and come back and the student would act like they didn't know me at all. And part of that's junior high. Okay, I get that. But man, I had to be a listener, a listener, a listener. And I kept asking myself, what's the most loving thing? Now, after a while, it gained traction. I became really well known, among the students, and I could move freely and among the staff. Well, then last year, they had an influx of 500 students, almost tripled the population of the school. And all of a sudden, I knew no one. And I had one little group of eighth graders that I'd been with since sixth grade, about a dozen of them. And then I knew no one else. Almost all the teachers were gone, everything. So I had to start all over again. And man, that is so debilitating. So I understand the person that says, and I hear it mostly from white people, but this idea, basically what it's saying is, now I've got to start all over again, in my understanding. So I didn't think this, but now I think that. And that's a real feeling, to feel like this is the way I thought the world was going to go, but now it's going a different way. But it is just like God to keep flipping how we understand the world, so we trust Him.
Yeah.
Everything that's happening is within the scope of God's work. And if you say, well, no, it's not, then I would encourage you to read your Bible and notice the context. Jesus's context, Paul's context. I mean, most of those people lose their life and we just blow by that. Almost every scene in the Old Testament is a scene that we would perceive as totally an unacceptable context for us to live in.
Yeah.
And yet God keeps taking people. So I'm getting back to your lesson, into the deepest waters. That's a question I wanted to ask you is, you had framed it where the Israelites and how everything seemed to be going this way, but God did something else. And you had two mountains. You kind of set up the scene. You had two mountains, the Egyptian army, and then the Red Sea. And it got me thinking a couple of things. One was, how many people would have died jumping into that Red Sea because it's full, it's big, it's flowing, that kind of thing. I don't know if it's sea, it's flowing. I don't know anything about seas, but anyway, but it's a lot of water, and they're trying to preserve their stuff and their kids and this kind of thing. But God put that pillar between them to basically buy time. And then he allowed the water, to part, there, and he made it through. But how many people would have died? And that's where I think we have to be really careful of jumping in. Hey, here's what I think. We're just going to jump in. And how many people spiritually will die if we just jump in without waiting on God? But I wanted to ask you about, if you were to, what are our rock and the hard places we're dealing with now that you see?
Okay, so let me think about that. While I do, let me talk. But it does make me think about when they go to cross into Jericho.
Oh, Jordan River.
The Jordan River.
Yeah.
I feel like in that story, leaving Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, God takes the time to part the water, and it makes very specifically they go through on dry land. When they cross the Jericho, if I remember right, the water is either high tide or flooding, moving rapidly, and right. God doesn't part the water until the leader's sandals touch it.
Yeah.
So there is a time when God says, you just got to trust me, and you got to walk into the fast flowing water, and I will save. And then there is a time when he says, let me show you the path.
Yeah.
Let me show you that I have a safe path prepared for you. And so I think the key in all of this is listening to God.
Yeah.
And with Memorial right now, trying to decide what are our next steps forward, it feels like we don't have precedent to lean on. Man, we wish we did. We wish we knew this is what happens every time somebody's church building burns down. This is what happens every time you're dealing with insurance. So once we come to the other side of this, other churches may ask us one day, so what did you do when your church burned down? And we can only tell them our story. We can't tell them, and that's what precedent is. That's what you do, because God may lead the next person in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
But rock and hard place right now, man, that it feels like what we've been talking about of a no-win situation of people are such opposite extremes, not listening to each other, and both sides have things to agree with, and both sides have things that are very wrong. But you can't, it feels like a rock and a hard place to say, I agree with either one, because the other one then is no longer listening.
Right.
So that to me, I don't know if that's
excellent.
What you're looking for.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, we have, when stuff happens in the world, I wonder, is this the devil really flexing? And God will redeem this, or is this God allowing things that he will redeem? And it's both true, but it's a little bit different actor, and I don't know how to distinguish that. There may be people smarter than I in this area, but this ties into, okay, regardless of which way it is, let's reference your contrast. You had a story for Moses and a story for Joshua, and two different groups of Israelites, because you've got a 40-year span between those events. And the first group died off mostly. Why did he tell that story? No, not tell. Why did he make those stories go different? And I've joked about this before, but I wonder, is Joshua, they get to the Jordan River, they know they've got to cross over because God said they're going to cross over, they're raised his staff, he was like, yeah. So I wonder if Joshua's got his staff and he's like, all right. And then God's like, call the priest. He's like, okay, and the priest lead. And I wonder if he even felt, Joe focused guy, but I wonder if he even felt, oh, bummer, this is not that same story again.
Yeah.
Because think about how much we want to relive other people's victories. We want it to feel a certain way. If I would have a race or complete a marathon I want it to feel like I imagined when I watched it on TV. You know what I mean? And Josh was a human just like us, so it had to cross his mind, oh, okay, we're going that direction. And then you have Elijah come on, and it's Elijah and Elisha years later, and there's a body of water, and he hits it with his cloak, and then it parts. And you're like, okay, here's the pop quiz. Which is the right way to cross a body of water with God?
Yeah.
Walked on the water and calm storm. You know what I mean? So it's like God seems to take this crossing water thing, and why does he do it? And here's the answer. He designed us uniquely so that he could meet us uniquely. And this is true of everybody. He calls Joshua different than he called Moses. He calls Moses different than he called Gideon, and so on and so on. Even the apostles, he called the 4 fishermen in a similar way, although Andrew and John had already interacted with them. And then he calls Nathaniel different and Matthew different. And so do we believe that God is smart enough to give us that third option? Like we have the rock in the hard place of I get the spirit of Black Lives Matter, the concept of it. And man, I agree. God created every person. Black lives have to. And at times we've sent the signal, Black lives don't. And maybe that's a lot or little, but that's wrong, you know? And then on the other hand, I'm like, it matters if you have not been a racist. It matters if you push back. It matters if you've invested in cultures of other kind. Like Tim, you spent years, you and Kim, investing in another race. That matters. And yet to say the only thing that matters is what's on social media, that's incorrect. That's judging by appearances. But you feel like you have to go in one or another camp.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is, do you believe creates a third way that is not only a more beautiful way, but individual that may impact us? But there are people that crossed the Red Sea that were impacted very differently. And I could dive into that deeper, but we'll just leave it at that.
Well, so it makes me think of Jesus in front of the Pharisees and the woman caught in adultery. And I think it's important to remember the woman was not in danger. They didn't have authority to kill Jesus. They had to go get authority to do that. So
Right.
She's not in danger of being killed right now. And it says explicitly this was a trap for Jesus.
Right.
Because if he says kill her, they'll go to the Romans and say, hey, he's usurping your authority and saying we should kill somebody. If he says don't kill her, they'll go to the Jews and say, hey, he doesn't believe in the law of Moses. And so I feel like he was in that rock and a hard place where there is no right answer. And that's where I think the waves are crashing and God leads a path through. And that's where we're at. Yeah. And the path through was mercy and love. There wasn't I agree with Moses or I agree with the Romans. It was, what is the loving thing to do for this woman? And I feel like that's been the side point of this series, but God, who is rich in mercy. And I feel like that is our answer when we are sitting with our friend who is a cop. What is merciful to do for his heartache right now?
Right.
When we sit with our friend who is African American, what is merciful to do?
Yes.
It feels to me right now like the answer is listening.
Yes.
And accompaniment. But what does that look like? So it feels like the answer is, but God, who is rich in mercy. And so the point being, when we see those waters crashing and we see the Red Sea in front of us, that is not a signal that we just hide. But it also isn't a signal that we've got to go to one or the other. For me, I feel like my lane is what's merciful right now.
Yeah, I love that, and that's obviously a clear expression of what loving thing to do is the lens we have to work on. Because if we start saying, what are my rights? What is legal? What is fair? we are judging that from a perspective that isn't completely objective. It's not God objective, you know? Whereas if we ask what's the most loving thing, and we're asking God, not just us, God, what is the most loving thing? One thing I don't think I've said, have I talked about the pendulum swing on this recording and
No.
how, okay.
No.
One of the things that's really important, I had an experience, and I've had this experience with multiple people over the years, that I realized I did something wrong. And this, it doesn't matter the race of the person. I realized I did something wrong. And I go to them and say, hey, I did that wrong. And instead of saying, I hear what you're saying, I'm going to think about it, or I forgive you, they unload on me about all the things I've done wrong over the whole relationship. You know what I mean? And man, it takes everything in me not to push back. You know what I mean? But I have to remind myself, wait, I'm here to apologize. Now, I think I realized what was happening there. Up to that moment where I humbled myself and apologized because of my role as a minister, an AIM leader, or whatever, because of my role, people didn't feel like they could tell me the truth. But once I humbled myself, all that truth came out. And when you are doing almost anything for the first time, you're not good at it. You are not going to be polished. And so when I'm talking to a person that hasn't felt safe to be honest, it's going to take them, just like it would take me, maybe 100 times to get it to a place where it's polished, that I say exactly what I really want to say and don't let my emotions take over or whatever. And I feel like if I'm a Christian, I'm the one that's supposed to go the extra mile. For me to start demanding somebody else go the extra mile with me or before me, that's not what Jesus teaches. I am the one. I don't care if the other person's Christian or not. I'm the one to die to self. And I just think that dynamic is really important. So let's say you're Cuban, you know, and I go to you and I say, hey, talk to me about, because I know you'd love to go to Cuba, or there was a time you really want to go to Cuba. Talk to me about being Cuban. And I've made it safe enough for you to say whatever you need to say. And you unload on me. Now, you know what you're going to say? Something that is not true about me. You will. Maybe it's because I'm over personalizing, or because you even just get into the flow of it. This happens all the time. Okay. I need to be the extra miler to listen and give you space. And the second conversation may be much like the same, and the third may be much like the same. But in time, the safer you, Tim, as a Cuban, feel, the more those edges will loose, and the love will really be there. But in my first time to share my pain, and we've experienced in our soul work experiences, it is not pretty when it comes out the first time. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing real work, it doesn't come out pretty. Yeah. You know, and that's part of why soul work, intensive soul work, is effective, and so many other things isn't, is because when you've got to stop and say, I've got to make this come across just right for the other person, it's not going to get said. Yeah. You're just going to become discouraged and not say anything.
Man, I feel like that's such a good connector there to say going the extra mile, because that's exactly what it feels like, and it's exactly what it violates my rights. I shouldn't have to accept your judgment of me. I shouldn't have to accept what you're saying that's not true. And that I shouldn't have to accept what you're saying about true blocks me from hearing what is true. Because it is just so hard when you know that, and they could say 5 things that are true and 5 things that aren't, but those 5 things that aren't, give me complete license not to listen to the 5 things that aren't.
That's right. Hey, I wanted to, I don't know our time, but I assume we're getting, I don't know how long. I'm timeless when I'm talking. Really, you'd said rallying around. You said 2 things that are kind of there. God's footprints may not be seen in front of us, but He is as surely there as He was for them. And then the idea of rallying around that story, that here's what God did for us. Talk to me more about what that looks like, or just your thoughts in general when you think about rallying around what God has done.
I think that story matters. It matters. I know I've said this before. We don't remember what happens. We remember about what we say about what happens. And that's why fishermen really think the fish they caught was this big, because that's the story they've been telling. Dusty and I tell the same stories that happened to us as kids, and I'm like, that was me. And he's like, no, that was me. We've both told it for
Yes.
so long.
Yes.
What we believe is what we tell. And so I think it's important to tell these stories of God's victory, because when we say, man, God did something great, and then it turns into something great happened. There was this event that was great, and God kind of disappears from the picture. Then the next time we're faced with our Red Sea, the story we've been telling wasn't of God separating it. And so it's important for us to own the Red Sea story as our heritage. And
Yes.
it's important for us to own moving to East Side from Memorial, that God provided something for us in advance. Um, so just whatever the story is, and Dad is full of stories of God providing. And it's almost like people can separate and go, well, that's Terry Rush. And we've talked about this, but we need to own every story we can of God's intervention. And that's what I mean by rallying around it. When we have our next COVID-19, when whatever that is, murder hornets or whatever it is, that we are owning the fact God has not let us down. God has
Yeah.
not left us. He's not forgotten who we are. God always provides. That's getting into this week's sermon. It may not be the timing we want it to be,
Yeah.
but we are a part of that upper story. I
Yeah.
think is how it's been worded at Memorial.
Man, that is so. I love that, and it makes me think, man, what do we need to do to preserve that story? You
Mm.
know, I yeah, I just that's given me a lot of food for thought there. One of the things that I think is really fundamental when you think about um, God is telling a story with my life, and you remind yourself, wait a minute, God was telling a story through John the Baptist's life, and that didn't end well,
Mm.
or Peter, or Paul, or the Apostle John, or even I think of King David and his last days. I just think were miserable. Moses dies not seeing what he was hoping to see for at least 40 years. Um, Joshua basically at the end of his life is saying, look, you do what you want. As for me and my house, we're going to worship the Lord. He's washing his hands of them. That couldn't have
Yeah.
been an encouraging place. And you're thinking, how does that make sense to walk with God when it still can end so badly?
Yeah.
And what I would say is, if you only think this physical life is what counts, then why would you even be a Christian hardly? You know what I mean? It just doesn't make sense to deny yourself. Now, maybe if you're a Christian and you don't deny yourself, it makes sense. I don't know. But the heart of Christianity is dying to yourself every day. That means being a second miler every day, every minute of every day. And our humanity, specifically our American humanity, we do not like that dynamic because we're so rights driven. And I get it, and I'm part of it. I struggle with it myself. But if you perceive that this is, and we've talked about this, Francis Chan was the first time I heard it. If you perceive that the life we're living right now is the shortest part, and the life that we're going to be in the presence of God is so long, it makes this almost irrelevant, then all of a sudden, I'm not nearly as worried about how this story goes. And then you start to think, what is it God wants from us most? To retire well, to have a legacy? No, it's to grow in our faith in Him.
Mm.
And it's when we tell these stories to encourage us to keep trusting when it doesn't make sense. And keep in mind, there is no need for faith as long as life makes sense. No need. It's only when life doesn't make sense. So it is never, this is the best time of my whole life to have faith. The less it makes sense, the best time for me to develop faith. And so this is, God's goals are not our goals. And to remind yourself of that is really important.
Yeah, I have a friend who his imagination of judgment is standing before God, and the judgment piece being, however much you depended on me, how much faith you had in me is how you will survive into eternity. So if our lives are one of faith in God, where we are in utter dependence of him, then utter dependence of him is the bridge into eternity. Whereas if we did not live in utter dependence of him, there's no bridge into eternity. I'm not saying it as well as he can, because the way I'm presenting it, there's a big, yeah, but what about grace? In that, but I do feel like that is our journey. Utter dependence on him is the sweet spot of existence.
Yeah.
And everything else is me trying to put props under what I think is what I really need.
Yeah.
And so this whole journey is in Acts, when Peter goes to the gate. He's been in prison and he escapes, and he goes to the gate, and they think it must be his ghost. I think that chapter, I can't remember what chapter it is, but I think that chapter starts with James is killed. So there's James is killed, then Peter, and he's released. And both are men who are just trusting in God for their deliverance. One is killed. And one has a continuing story to tell, but it's not about who dies and who lives. It's about is the utter dependence upon God.
Yeah.
And then you can go to your death and see it as, well, I'm about to see something completely different.
Right.
And trust
that. I like that contrast is really poignant. The dynamic of life doesn't make any sense without eternal life to me. Alzheimer's. Why would God allow dementia and Alzheimer's if there's not eternal life? I mean, that would be the most unloving thing. My belief is we will either discover here on earth or certainly discover in heaven what God is doing with that person when they have forgotten their identity, forgotten who they are. And that is so painful. To me, that's one of those maddening parts of living on this earth, is those spaces you're like, what is happening here? Because God could end it in a millisecond. He can. So him choosing not to means there's something happening there that couldn't be accomplished otherwise. And I'm intrigued with it, but without eternal life, it makes no sense.
Right.
But that's true of all life. Without eternal life, life makes no sense.
Yeah, and I see a pattern in my life, and I think that this is honestly, it can make me very angry with God. I think from bigger picture, it shows God's mercy. But when hard things happen, God generally steps in to change it after, I can't say after I give up, but after I become angry and bittered.
Yeah.
I endure, persevere, and it almost feels like there's a finish line that obviously I can't see, and I end before I get to the finish line with bitterness and anger, and then God says, "Oh man, had you waited one more day, or had you waited this much more, you would see this is what I was doing."
Yeah.
But it feels like it makes me angry when it's happening. Now I can look back on my life and go, oh wow, God was really merciful,
right,
to offer me mercy at those bitterness and anger points, and continue to be in. But it does feel like that of God when you say Alzheimer's and dementia. Like, man, God, what is this for? Why would that even be allowable? And so will we step into faith and say, you've got something bigger that is beyond any piece of imagination that we have?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, I'm telling you, this conversation, I could go. And so
Okay, so
I
I don't
froze.
know how I don't know how to come out on the recording,
Yeah.
but it went. I'm telling you, this conversation, I could go.
So let me finish that thought.
Yeah,
I have three solid threads that this conversation could go in, but I know we need to wrap up. But I think this is part of certainly what I enjoy most about our relationship is I'm always learning from you, from God,
yeah,
or through you from God. And it always stimulates me on to think, okay, wait a minute, what about this?
yeah,
I hadn't even thought about how God would work in that. And I think this is an example that I'm grateful for of iron sharpening iron, because now I'm like, okay, now that I've said that out loud and then your feedback, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, what something new God is teaching me even right now. So just very
yeah.
grateful, grateful for you, grateful for this conversation.
Yeah, I will say I feel today, like anytime we talk about some of these subjects, it makes me aware that this is recorded.
Oh yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
in cancel culture, I think there, one thing I love about this relationship is in the privacy of our office, we can talk and say, this is how I feel. And
Right.
the other can say, okay, now come back down from that. I wish that I could say when I agree or I disagree with both ends. I wish I could say what I want to say. But in cancel culture today,
Yeah.
uh, I would then be defined by what it was I said, and not,
Right.
hey, can I express this out loud?
Yeah.
And you push back on that. So I feel like that there's something to um, the reality that in our relationship we have a safe space of doing that. Putting
Yeah.
that on the internet, not not so safe.
Yeah, exactly. And I acknowledge I have some fear around this. Um, yeah, I acknowledge I have some fear. I have fear around
Yeah.
this, and I think that's okay. I have safeguards, as we mentioned earlier. Our elders, if we've said something problematic, we know they'll talk to us,
Mm-hmm.
not just talk at us. And
Yeah.
and so I feel, and our church is extremely forgiving and kind and grace filled. And hopefully they realize by now I'm a big time needing to learn guy. So
Yeah.
yeah, like I say in a lot of things, man, if there is something that, if there are people still watching, and there's something you think, well, wait a minute, you haven't thought about that, I guarantee you're probably right. And so you may be the person that I need to talk to me.
Yeah.
So just make sure, say it in the most loving way you can, but bring the truth.
Yeah. Because we are human, and we are
That's right, man.
admitting when you bring up when you bring it up, our reaction may become defensive. It's not who we
Yeah,
want to be.
that's right.
Um,
That's right.
and,
Yeah.
and this does also make me grateful thinking of how many people in our church. I feel like there are some that we have given specific permission to hold us accountable.
Yes.
They know, I feel like they know who they are, and if you think you may be one of them, if you think you may be one, you may not be. And so ask us, step into that relationship and say,
Right.
would you let me hold you accountable? And I feel like if somebody's coming with that question, our response will be, that's what we want. So
Sure. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Now I have three more threads. We should
yeah,
end. All right, man. Love you.
love you, man.
Talk
Appreciate
to you
this
later.
conversation. All right.